In this video, we're going to discuss how to make your thesis statements more parallel. And that's very important because making a thesis more parallel makes it much easier to read and understand. And that's especially true if you have a multi-part thesis. You want each part to be parallel, to have the same grammatical structure. And if you are giving multiple reasons, you also want those reasons to be parallel and have the same grammatical structure. So let's start by looking at the first two thesis statements here. In each of these two, I have the term being defined in italics, just so you know what's being defined, and then the different parts are underlined. So read just A and B, and then pause the video first, read A and B, decide which you think is more parallel and why, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So you can pause the video now. Okay, so B is the more parallel thesis statement. Let's first take a look at why A is not parallel. So A is not parallel because each of these three different underlined parts are a different structure. The first is just a one-word adjective. Then the last two are both independent clauses, so a completely different structure. And then between them, they're very different. One begins with common interests, the other begins with one, so they're beginning with different kinds of nouns. The verbs are different. This is just a present tense, and this is can trust with a helping verb. So even though they're both independent clauses, they're structured very differently. And that's why this reads so awkwardly and it's harder to understand. In contrast, B is much more parallel, and it uses the verb first structure, which is one of the best ways to make the parts of your thesis parallel. Just divide each part into a little clause and begin it with a verb that has the same tense. So these all begin with enjoys, shares, deserves, right? Each is a present tense verb. And then the rest of the structure is similar. One's company, one's interest, one's trust. Now you wouldn't have to repeat one necessarily, but you'd have to have a word in there that's of a similar type to make it parallel. And so this reads in a much more clear and comprehensible fashion. So this technique is really the verb first technique, and again, make sure your tenses are consistent. All right, let's take a look at the next pairing here, C and D. So read those two and see which seems to be more parallel, and then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, so in this one, D is more parallel. Let's first look and see why C is not parallel. All right, so C, if you look at the different parts that are underlined, you have a one-word structure here, then you have a little clause here, an independent clause, and another completely different independent clause. So they're all different, right? And the independent clauses begin with different things, it versus one, and then is familiar, so it ends with a one-word object. This is a different thing, feels pleasure being there, so they're not at all parallel. Whereas in D, we have three parallel words, security, familiarity, and pleasure. And all of those are nouns, so we have three nouns, and that makes it nice and parallel. And this is the other way that you can make a thesis statement parallel, and that's by using a series of words or phrases that are the same type for each part of the thesis that you cover. So they could be all nouns like this, or all noun phrases, so they could be a noun with a little phrase. They could be all adjectives, all adjective phrases. I mean, you know, anything that's parallel. Now, the one caveat I have for this is it's not always possible to be specific enough when you're laying out the parts of your thesis if you're limiting each part to just one word. Sometimes you can, in this case it works, but sometimes you can't. And often what happens is one of the three you can't quite capture with one word. And so if that happens, you need to then say, well, let me go with the verb first clause structure. So these are just some strategies that'll help you make your thesis statement more parallel and easier to read.